When I walked into the garage that morning and saw him crouched beside the toolbox, something inside me tightened, not because I feared anything improper, but because of how familiar his presence felt in a place that had always belonged to someone else. He looked up, his face lit softly by the sunlight slicing through the dusty window, and for a split second, I saw not a boy I'd helped raise, but a man who didn't belong to me. My breath caught. It wasn't attraction, not then. It was something more elusive. Recognition, maybe. Of what, I wasn't ready to admit. I asked if he needed help, and he smiled like he used to when he was 12, like I'd just offered to make his favorite sandwich. I sat beside him without thinking. Our arms touched briefly as I handed him a wrench, and I remember feeling the warmth of his skin through both our sleeves. I didn't move away. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. Something unspoken hovered between us, delicate as cobweb thread. I went back into the house afterwards, washed my hands in silence, and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. That's when I realized, this wasn't about him. Not really. It was about me. About everything I had stopped feeling a long time ago. And that was the beginning. But before I tell you how things truly unraveled, before I take you through the moments I still replay at night, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and have you ever had a moment so subtle, so ordinary, it quietly changed the course of your life? I stood in the kitchen, drying a glass that hadn't really needed washing, just to have something in my hands. My husband's suitcase was still by the door, unopened. He hadn't said much since returning from his 3-day trip. He never did. He gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, asked about dinner, and disappeared into his home office like the man I'd married had become a polite tenant I occasionally saw in shared spaces. The silence in our house had a particular sound, sharp, metallic, like the clink of silverware against an empty plate. I had gotten used to it, or so I told myself. Then I heard the front door creak open. A second suitcase landed beside the first. I turned, and there he was. My stepson. Taller than I remembered, broader in the shoulders. He looked different, but his expression was the same, tired, but gentle, as if he were always waiting for you to speak first. "Hey," he said. His voice was deeper than I remembered. That surprised me. I nodded and smiled, suddenly aware of how I must look in my faded cardigan and slippers. "You didn't say you were coming." He shrugged, like that detail didn't matter. Figured I'd just show up. Needed a break. From what, he didn't say. I didn't ask. That was the nature of our relationship, close, but lightly drawn. My husband stepped out just long enough to say, "Hey, didn't expect you," then added, "Room's yours if you want it," before disappearing again. That was all the welcome he offered. No hug, no warmth. Not out of coldness, I think, but because he had forgotten how to be warm. Later that evening, I made pasta. The three of us sat at the table, but it felt like 3 separate meals happening in the same room. My husband scrolled through his phone, barely touching his plate. My stepson and I made small talk, weather, his drive, some vague mention of job stuff. At one point, I asked if anything needed fixing in the garage, just to fill the space. He said, "Actually, yeah. That shelf's still loose. I can help you with it tomorrow if you want." I looked at my husband. He didn't react. I turned back to the younger man across from me. "Sure," I said. "That'd be nice." After dinner, my husband vanished upstairs, leaving his plate untouched. My stepson and I cleared the table together, and I noticed how naturally we moved, passing dishes, rinsing, loading the dishwasher, like a rhythm we'd somehow retained despite years apart. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the house. I heard footsteps outside my room. His room was across the hall now. Not the guest room, not the basement. That simple change unnerved me more than I expected. In the morning, I found him already in the garage, kneeling beside the same old toolbox his father never touched. Light poured in through the dusty window, making the whole room feel suspended in time. He looked up and smiled when I entered. I hesitated before stepping in. My husband had always claimed that space. I felt like a trespasser. But he motioned for me to join him, and something about the invitation felt easy. We started sorting boxes, old tools, forgotten cords, broken electronics that hadn't worked in a decade. At one point, a box tipped and spilled onto the floor. I bent to help gather the contents, and our hands brushed. He paused. I did too. The contact was brief, but it lingered. A warmth that passed from skin to nerve to thought. Neither of us said anything. Afterwards, we washed our hands side by side. I watched him in the mirror's reflection, noting the sharpness of his jaw, the way his shoulders moved. His frame was no longer the lanky outline of a teenager. He was a man. The rest of the day passed quietly. My husband was busy with phone calls. My stepson retreated to his room with his laptop. I lingered in the kitchen, pretending to organize the spice rack just so I'd have an excuse to walk past the hallway. At dinner, only two of us sat at the table. My husband had ordered takeout to his office. He still does that, my stepson asked, tilting his head toward the closed door. I nodded. Always. He chewed in silence, then said, "You look tired." I wasn't sure what surprised me more, that he noticed, or that he cared to say it. I gave a small smile. I guess I am. You shouldn't be. I didn't reply. I didn't trust my voice. Later that evening, I found myself replaying the moment in the garage. That fleeting brush of skin. The way he'd looked at me. It wasn't desire. Not yet. But it was something. Attention. Presence. Recognition. And I hadn't felt that in a very long time. I went to bed early, but not to sleep. My thoughts circled in slow, deliberate loops. I thought about the garage, the dinner, the sound of his voice saying I looked tired. I remembered how his father had never said that. Never noticed. And that night, for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. The following morning began with the sound of clinking mugs and the scent of toast burning slightly in the toaster. I had risen earlier than usual, an old habit when I couldn't sleep well. The house was quiet, save for the usual hum of the refrigerator and the soft creaks in the wooden floor as I moved about the kitchen. My husband had already left for work, leaving only a crumpled napkin on the counter and his unfinished coffee mug in the sink. It felt strangely peaceful. I stood by the window, holding my own mug of coffee between both hands. The light was just beginning to pour through the trees, casting long diagonal shadows across the floor. I took a sip and watched the backyard slowly brighten, my mind still tethered to yesterday's moments, the garage, the unexpected touch, the way I had felt seen. He came downstairs about an hour later, barefoot and still slightly disheveled from sleep. He gave me a small nod, then reached for the kettle. "Morning," he said casually, his voice still rough. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my tone even. My stomach tightened, though I wasn't sure why. We made breakfast in near silence, moving around each other as though choreographed. At one point, we reached for the same plate and our hands brushed again. It lasted no more than a second, but it was enough to reignite something under my skin. Later that day, I found myself in the laundry room sorting through a pile of mixed clothes. His things had blended into ours without anyone noticing, socks, shirts, the familiar scent of detergent and cologne. It was oddly intimate, folding his clothes. I caught myself smoothing the sleeve of his sweatshirt more than necessary, holding it a moment longer than I should have. The laundry room was tucked away in a narrow corner of the house, barely big enough for two people to stand side by side. There was something about the cramped space, the steady sound of the washer cycling, the warmth in the air, it all made the world outside feel very far away. That afternoon, he knocked on the frame of the open door as I was carrying a load of towels. "I was going to fix that loose shelf today," he said. "Want to help again?" I hesitated. I could have said I was busy, or tired, or simply not in the mood. But instead, I nodded. We returned to the garage. Dust danced in the rays of sunlight spilling through the window. He had already laid out the tools. As we worked, we fell into an easy rhythm, unscrewing bolts, holding planks in place, passing each other the drill or level. "I forgot how much junk we had in here," he said at one point, chuckling. I smiled. "Some of it probably dates back to before you were born." He looked at me then, really looked. "You don't seem old enough for that." The comment was offhand, maybe even innocent. But it landed differently. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, like he meant it. I turned away quickly, pretending to focus on a stubborn screw. After the shelf was mounted and secure, we both sat on the edge of an overturned crate, catching our breath. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, then glanced over. "You always kept things together, even when Dad didn't," he said, not as an accusation, but more as an observation. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said nothing. We just sat in that dusty stillness, with the low whir of the house behind us. Later that evening, after he'd gone upstairs, I wandered into the living room and stared at the family photo on the shelf, taken years ago during a beach trip. I was smiling in it, genuinely, but it looked like someone else's life. A version of me that had been asleep for years. That night, something shifted. I couldn't fall asleep. My husband was next to me, already breathing heavily, unaware of the storm quietly building inches away from him. I got up, unable to lie still any longer, and padded softly down the hallway toward the kitchen. The light above the stove cast a warm halo. I opened the fridge more out of habit than hunger, grabbed a bottle of water, and turned. He was there, leaning against the doorframe. Barefoot again. Wearing an old t-shirt that clung to his frame in a way that made my breath catch, though I tried not to show it. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Not really," I admitted. "You?" He shook his head. "Jet lag, maybe." We stood in silence for a moment. The house felt impossibly quiet around us, like the air was holding its breath. He stepped forward, slowly, not close enough to be alarming, but just enough to make me aware of every heartbeat. I could feel the tension between us, heavy but unspoken. There are moments in life that stretch, that seem to hover in time. Moments you know, even while they're happening, that you'll remember long after they've passed. This was one of them. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. But something lived in that silence, an acknowledgement, maybe. A fracture forming. Eventually, I broke the moment by glancing at the clock and saying I should try to sleep. He nodded, stepping aside to let me pass. As I walked back to my room, my skin still tingled where his gaze had lingered. I slipped under the covers, my husband still asleep, oblivious. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. I wasn't afraid of what was happening, not exactly. But I was aware of it now. Aware of myself in a way I hadn't been in years. The next morning would come, like always. But tonight, something had begun. Something I couldn't name yet, but I felt it. Deep, quiet, and dangerously real. I woke up feeling the weight of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't guilt, not exactly. It was heavier than guilt, quieter than shame. Like a presence that had decided to stay in the room long after the moment had passed. The air in the house seemed different, denser, perhaps, or simply more aware. Maybe it was just me. Maybe everything was the same, and only I had changed. I moved through the morning routine, making coffee, folding laundry, opening windows to let in the late spring air, with a mechanical sense of purpose. But my mind wasn't on the tasks. It was looping around yesterday, like a ribbon stuck in the blades of a fan, fluttering and twisting but never breaking loose. My husband had already left for the day. His absence didn't surprise me, and it didn't hurt either. It was just one more silence in a long series of silences. We had grown used to it, navigating our days like parallel trains on different tracks, running through the same stations without ever stopping at the same time. In the kitchen, I opened the cabinet to reach for a mug and paused when I noticed the faint trace of his cologne, my stepson's, still lingering on the sleeves of the sweater he'd worn yesterday. I had hung it over a chair without thinking, and now it sat there like an object in a museum, soaked in meaning I hadn't intended to assign. I picked it up and folded it gently. I told myself it was just laundry. Just cotton and scent. Nothing more. Later, in the laundry room, I sorted a basket of clothes. The rhythm of the task usually calmed me, but today I felt disoriented, distracted by thoughts I had no business entertaining. His clothes were mixed with ours now. A shirt with frayed cuffs. Socks that never stayed matched. A pair of jeans folded twice too many times. Then I saw his phone. It had been left on the shelf above the washer, screen down, humming with a notification. I hadn't even heard him come down that morning, and now I realized he must have started a load and forgotten it there. I froze, my hand still hovering over a towel. I shouldn't have touched it. I knew that. But something in me moved before my judgment caught up. I picked up the phone, flipped it over. The screen lit up, a message preview, just a few words, from someone named Lily. The words weren't inappropriate, not overtly. But they were close. Familiar. My chest tightened. I told myself it was none of my business. I told myself to put it down. But I didn't. I opened the gallery. The latest video played automatically, muted. I didn't mean to watch. It was just there. My fingers hovered, unsure whether to close it or let it continue. I stood frozen, the light from the screen flickering across my face. It wasn't explicit, but it was undeniably intimate. He had recorded it for someone, clearly. It was careful, composed. There was a seriousness to it that startled me. Not vanity, not ego. It was something else. Something tender. I paused the video and stared at the still frame. I should have felt embarrassment. Or shame. Or at the very least, guilt. But what I felt was far more dangerous, fascination. Not with the content itself, but with the thought that someone had made him feel wanted enough to do this. Wanted. Desired. Seen. I placed the phone back exactly where I found it and stepped away, my hands trembling slightly. I didn't know why it affected me so deeply, only that it did. It wasn't the physicality that stirred me. It was the emotional context. The clarity with which I saw what had been missing in my own life. I had not been looked at like that in years. Noticed. Not simply observed. By noon, I was sitting on the back porch with a book in my lap, pages unmoving. The sun was out, the grass had been freshly cut, and yet the only thing I could feel was the hum of unresolved tension under my skin. He came out sometime after lunch, carrying his own coffee. He sat across from me without a word, and for a moment, I thought he might say something. Anything. But he just sipped quietly, eyes focused on the garden. I glanced at him, trying to gauge whether he suspected anything. I felt self-conscious, irrationally so, but also painfully aware of his presence. The afternoon passed slowly. I cleaned the pantry, vacuumed the upstairs hallway, wiped down doorknobs. I needed motion. Anything to pull my thoughts back into the world of the physical. That evening, we sat at the dinner table again. My husband was absent, called away to meet a client. Another missed meal. Another empty chair. My stepson asked if I wanted help loading the dishwasher. I nodded, and we worked side by side in silence. It was becoming a familiar pattern. One that comforted me and unsettled me in equal measure. As he turned to leave the kitchen, he paused. "Thanks," he said. Just that. No explanation. I looked up, unsure how to respond. "For what?" I asked, my voice low. He shrugged slightly, then said, "For being here." And then he walked away. Later that night, I sat in the living room alone, lights dimmed, wrapped in a throw blanket that suddenly felt too warm. I thought about his words. About the video. About the way I hadn't pulled my hand away that morning when we brushed shoulders reaching for the same pot. It would be so easy, I thought, to pretend nothing was changing. To write it all off as coincidence, as projection, as the lonely imaginings of a woman quietly fading in her own home. But I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Something had shifted. Not just in him. In me. And once that shift begins, it's almost impossible to stop. The next morning began with a strange quiet, different from the usual one. It wasn't the typical, predictable silence of our home, this was layered. Tense, but not uncomfortable. Still, but pulsing. I moved through it as though walking through a room that had just been vacuumed, afraid to make a single mark. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee. He had made it this time. That alone shifted the atmosphere. I entered to find 2 mugs on the counter, one of them already poured for me, steam curling like a ribbon above it. He wasn't in the room, but his presence lingered in every detail, the angle of the handle, the careful way he had placed a napkin underneath the mug. I picked it up, brought it to my lips, and paused. Something about this felt too intimate. Too thoughtful. And yet, I drank. He entered a few minutes later, dressed in a clean t-shirt and jeans, his hair still damp from the shower. I glanced up, nodded, but said nothing. He did the same. The tension between us no longer hid in the background. It lived in our quiet, in the air between every small movement. After a few minutes of pretending to read emails on my phone, I asked if he still needed help organizing the second shelf in the garage. It was an innocent question in tone. But we both knew better. His eyes flicked to mine for a second too long, then he nodded. "Yeah. If you have time." We spent the next hour sifting through dusty containers and misplaced tools. I found an old radio I'd forgotten we owned, its surface covered in cobwebs. He plugged it in, and miraculously, it still worked. Static at first, and then the sound of some old rock song filled the space. He chuckled and turned it down to a low hum. We didn't speak much. But the silence wasn't empty, it was full of small glances, of awareness, of the occasional brush of a hand reaching for the same tool. We worked slowly, methodically, as though dragging out the task was safer than finishing it too quickly. At one point, we both reached for the same screwdriver. Our fingers touched again, like they had before. But this time, neither of us pulled away. He let me take it, his eyes lingering on my face a fraction longer than they should have. I turned away quickly, pretending to study the contents of the next box, my heart thudding louder than the music. Later, as we stepped out of the garage, he stopped me by the door. "You've always been like this?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I tilted my head, unsure what he meant. "Like what?" "Calm. But sharp." Not in a bad way. Just aware. It was a strange compliment. Unpolished, but sincere. I didn't know how to receive it. So I smiled, a brief curve of the lips, and said nothing. That afternoon, I went upstairs to change the bedding in the guest room. As I pulled off the sheets, I noticed a small notebook tucked under the pillow. I didn't mean to pry. But my fingers moved before I could stop them. Inside were scribbles, lists, ideas, reminders. A few lines caught my eye, a phrase about feeling disconnected. Another about wanting to feel grounded. None of it was incriminating. But it was deeply human. Vulnerable in a way he didn't show outwardly. I closed the notebook and left it exactly where I found it. By early evening, a storm had begun to build outside. The sky had turned that particular shade of gray that comes before a heavy downpour. I lit a few candles just in case we lost power, as we sometimes did when the wind pushed too hard against the trees. He came downstairs holding a pair of socks and asked if the dryer had finished its cycle. I nodded and motioned toward the laundry room. He disappeared for a few minutes, and I heard the low hum of him folding clothes, something few men did with care, but he always had. When he returned, the power flickered for a brief moment. The lights dimmed, then steadied again. He looked at me, eyebrows raised. "Think it'll hold?" "Hopefully," I replied. But we both knew it wasn't really about the electricity. Dinner was quiet. My husband called to say he'd be late, again. Some emergency at work, some meeting that had run over. I didn't ask for details. I'd stopped asking years ago. He had stopped offering them even earlier. We ate at the kitchen island, side by side this time. It felt different. The air outside thickened as rain began to tap against the windows. He told me a story about college, something embarrassing involving a class presentation and the wrong set of slides. I laughed, genuinely. It had been a long time since anyone had made me laugh without trying. After dinner, I washed the dishes while he dried them. An old routine, but it felt new. His fingers grazed mine when we passed a glass. I looked up at him, and for a brief second, we both simply looked. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't flirtation. It was recognition. Of the line we were walking. Of the weight it carried. That night, I sat in the living room alone again. The rain had picked up, streaking the windows like delicate fingers. I curled up in the armchair, a blanket over my knees, and tried to read. But the words blurred. I couldn't stop replaying the day in my mind. The garage. The compliment. The notebook. The dinner. All of it looping in slow, quiet tension. I told myself nothing had happened. Not really. No boundary had been crossed. But deep inside, I knew that was a lie. Something was unfolding. Something more dangerous than an act. Something emotional. Subtle. It had no shape, no name. But it was there. And I was no longer trying to pretend otherwise. The day began as most others did, with a heaviness that had grown familiar. I stood by the kitchen window, sipping coffee and watching the condensation bead along the glass. Outside, the trees swayed gently, their movements slow and rhythmic, like they had nothing to prove. I envied them their rootedness, their unbothered presence. Inside, the quiet felt louder than usual. My husband had left early again. He'd said something about a business breakfast the night before, but I hadn't asked for details. I rarely did anymore. Conversations between us had become routine exchanges of logistics, like coworkers managing the same calendar. It wasn't anger that had built the wall between us, it was time. Quiet, efficient time. I glanced at the hallway and listened for footsteps. Nothing. But a few minutes later, I heard the door to his room open. My stepson's light tread moved across the floor, stopping briefly before entering the kitchen. He greeted me softly, then poured himself a cup of coffee. The way he moved in the house had changed, no longer tentative, but comfortably present. He sat at the kitchen island, scrolling through something on his phone while I wiped down the counter. The silence between us didn't feel awkward anymore. It had begun to hold its own shape, an understanding that words weren't always necessary. "I was thinking," he said finally, his voice breaking the stillness, "I should probably repaint the garage door. It's been bothering me." I nodded. "That's not a bad idea. Wanna come with me to the store?" I could use another opinion. It was a simple offer. Casual. But it felt like something else beneath the surface. I hesitated, then agreed. "Sure. Let me grab my jacket." The drive to the store was quiet at first, filled with soft background music and the hum of the engine. The streets were familiar, but I hadn't driven that route in a long time. Most days, my world existed between rooms, kitchen, bedroom, laundry, garage. Rarely beyond. As we pulled into the parking lot, I noticed how easily the conversation began to flow. He talked about his first apartment, the one he left behind when he came back here. I listened as he described the cracked tiles in the bathroom, the way the heater rattled all night in the winter. There was humor in his voice, but also something else, an underlying restlessness I recognized. Inside the store, we wandered through the paint aisle, comparing shades of blue and gray. He picked up a color swatch and held it next to my sweater. "This one matches you," he said without thinking. I looked at him, and he seemed to realize what he'd said. He smiled, almost sheepishly, but didn't take it back. I didn't respond. Not out loud. But something in me shifted again, the way a curtain moves slightly when a window is opened. I felt seen, not as a fixture in the house, not as his father's wife, but as a person. We picked out a paint can, some brushes, and a few other supplies. At the checkout, I watched him joke with the cashier, easy and relaxed. It occurred to me how comfortable he had become around me. Or maybe I had simply let go of the version of him I used to hold in my mind. The drive back was filled with a different energy. Less small talk. More awareness. The kind that isn't spoken but lives in glances, in quiet breathing, in the way hands rest just a little closer than necessary on the console. When we returned, he carried the supplies inside while I put on the kettle. It had begun to rain again, soft, persistent droplets tapping against the windows. The house felt warmer, as if something invisible had curled up in the corners. He joined me at the table, shaking the water from his sleeves. "Want some tea?" I asked, already pouring. "Sure," he replied, his voice low. We sat across from each other, the space between us filled with steam and silence. I watched the way his fingers curled around the mug, the way his eyes lingered on mine a fraction longer than they used to. There was no flirting. No overt invitation. Just presence. A few moments passed before either of us spoke again. "You know," he began, "it's been easier being here than I thought it would be." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "Easier how?" "I don't know," he said, shrugging. "I thought it would feel temporary. Like a stopover. But it doesn't. Not lately." I nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. He looked away, then back. "I guess that has a lot to do with you." His words landed softly, but firmly. I wasn't sure what to do with them. So I sipped my tea and looked out the window, pretending to be more focused on the rain than the way my pulse had begun to race. Later, after he went upstairs to take a call, I wandered into the laundry room to check on a load I'd forgotten about. The scent of fabric softener filled the air, familiar and oddly comforting. As I opened the dryer, I noticed a shirt of his folded neatly on top. I lifted it, felt the softness between my fingers. Without thinking, I pressed it briefly to my cheek, then set it down just as quickly, ashamed of the gesture. That evening, we had dinner together again. My husband texted to say he was stuck at the office. I didn't bother replying. We cooked something simple, grilled vegetables and pasta, and ate side by side at the counter. The kitchen felt like ours, somehow. Not mine and my husband's. Not a shared space between strangers. Just a quiet place between two people who understood each other in a way that didn't need explaining. After dinner, he offered to do the dishes. I dried them, standing shoulder to shoulder as the water ran and plates clinked softly. At one point, we reached for the same glass. Our hands met. This time, there was no flinch. No apology. We looked at each other. And we kissed. It was brief. Wordless. A moment suspended in time. And then it was over. He stepped back first, eyes searching mine for something: permission, forgiveness, understanding. I wasn't sure what he saw, only that I didn't look away. The rest of the night passed quietly. He retreated to his room. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the same family photo on the mantel, the one taken years ago when we all still smiled on command. Something irreversible had just happened. I didn't know what it meant yet. But I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. Not now. Not anymore. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for my breathing to slow, for my thoughts to quiet. But neither of those things happened. The house was still, so still it felt like it was holding its breath with me. My husband's side of the bed remained untouched. He had texted late that he was staying at a hotel near the office, claiming it was too late to drive back. I had responded with a single word, okay. But nothing felt okay. The moment we had shared in the kitchen looped in my mind, not with urgency, but with the weight of something too significant to file away. It hadn't been impulsive. It hadn't been confusing. It had been clear. The clarity of it was what frightened me. In the morning, I moved through my routine with deliberate slowness. I folded laundry that didn't need folding, wiped counters already clean, rearranged the fruit bowl twice. I couldn't sit still. I couldn't let my mind wander too far either. When I walked past the hallway leading to his room, I paused. The door was open. His bed was made. There was a half-empty coffee mug on the desk, a pair of running shoes by the closet. Everything was perfectly in place. I moved on. By mid-morning, he appeared in the kitchen, dressed in a soft gray sweatshirt and jeans, hair slightly messy from sleep. He didn't greet me with words. Just a glance. A quiet look that acknowledged everything without naming it. We moved around each other in silence, him pouring coffee, me slicing bread. The air between us was no longer filled with question marks, it was thick with awareness. And neither of us tried to fill it with small talk. Around noon, I mentioned that I needed to pick up a few things from the store. He offered to come along. I said yes too quickly. The drive was short, filled with music and occasional glances that said more than any conversation could. We didn't discuss the night before. There was no awkwardness, no need for explanation. But everything had shifted. At the store, we wandered through aisles with a strange sense of ease. He pushed the cart while I tossed in the usual things: vegetables, bread, a few household supplies. At one point, he reached for a jar on a high shelf and handed it to me without a word. Our fingers brushed, and we both paused, only for a second. "Thanks," I said, too softly. He nodded. At checkout, he insisted on paying. I didn't argue. It felt oddly natural. On the way back, we stopped for gas. While he filled the tank, I sat in the passenger seat, watching the reflections of passing cars in the side mirror. Everything looked so normal, so mundane, yet I felt like I was floating outside of myself. Suspended between what I had always known and what I couldn't yet define. Back home, he carried the bags inside while I started unpacking. The rhythm of the task settled me. Familiar motions, repetitive actions. I found comfort in the clatter of cans on the shelf, the crinkle of plastic, the closing of cabinet doors. After everything was put away, we both ended up in the living room. It wasn't planned. He sat on the floor, leaning against the couch, flipping through a book he'd picked up from the shelf. I curled up in the armchair, legs tucked beneath me, a magazine in hand I wasn't actually reading. Outside, the sky had turned heavy again, the light dull and pale. It was one of those afternoons that blurred into itself, too quiet to feel like day, too early for evening. The kind of time that feels like it doesn't belong anywhere. He closed his book eventually and looked up. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded, setting the magazine aside. "Are you happy?" The question struck me like a slow echo. Not because it was unexpected, but because it wasn't. It was the kind of question I'd asked myself in whispers for years. And now someone had dared to say it aloud. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at the rug. At my hands resting in my lap. "I don't know," I said finally. "I think I forgot what happy feels like." He didn't press. He just nodded slowly, eyes never leaving mine. That was something he did often, he looked and stayed looking, as if it mattered. "You don't have to answer this," he said, "but when did that start?" I took a breath, letting the air fill my lungs like a signal to be honest. Maybe it wasn't one moment. Maybe it was a slow undoing. 1,000 quiet days that blurred into each other. I stopped noticing. Or maybe I stopped believing it could change. He sat with that for a while. Then said, almost to himself, "You deserve more than that." We didn't speak again for the rest of the afternoon. But his words lingered, echoing in places I had forgotten to tend to. That evening, the power went out. Not all at once. The lights flickered first, then faded completely. The heater stopped humming. The refrigerator gave a soft sigh as it shut down. Silence wrapped itself around the house like a blanket. I found candles in the drawer, lit a few, and placed them in the living room. The flames danced against the walls, casting soft shadows. He came down a moment later with a flashlight and handed it to me. We sat in the dim glow, listening to the wind outside. The world had slowed, narrowed to the space between flickering lights and shared silence. He stood up after a while and walked to the window, watching the dark street. "It's kind of peaceful," he said. "It is," I replied. Then, without turning around, he asked, "Do you want me to stay?" The question wasn't about the night or the moment. It was bigger than that. And I knew it. I stood, walked over, and joined him at the window. The two of us, side by side, watching a world that suddenly felt far away. I looked at him. He looked at me. And we spent the night together. The morning light filtered through the curtains with a pale softness, barely illuminating the room. I woke slowly, blinking at the ceiling, letting the silence sink in. The world outside hadn't changed, birds still called distantly, the wind still rustled the trees, but something inside me felt unmistakably different. It wasn't guilt. Not even regret. It was clarity, of the uncomfortable kind. The kind that settles deep into the bones and waits to be acknowledged. I sat up, drawing the blanket closer to my body, not from cold but from a strange sense of exposure. The room was quiet, the air still heavy from the night before. I could hear water running faintly from the bathroom down the hall. A door clicked softly shut. He was awake. And so was I, truly awake for the first time in a long while. Moving slowly, I stepped into the hallway, feet bare against the cool floorboards. The door to his room was open, but he wasn't there. I passed by, heart pacing itself a little too fast, and made my way to the kitchen. He was already there, standing by the stove, flipping something in a pan. Scrambled eggs, judging by the smell. 2 plates were set on the counter, side by side, like a quiet continuation of what we'd shared without words. He looked up when I entered, offered a small, steady nod. I returned it, my throat too tight to speak at first. But the silence wasn't awkward. It was deliberate, protective. A moment of shared awareness held in stillness. I poured myself coffee, the sound of it grounding me. The steam curled upward as I leaned against the counter, cradling the mug in my hands. I hadn't yet decided how I felt about what had happened, only that it had, and that nothing would return to the way it was before. We ate without much conversation. The kitchen was filled with the soft clink of forks against plates, the occasional clearing of a throat. He said something about the power being restored, and how he'd check the circuit breaker later. I nodded, grateful for the ordinary subject. After breakfast, he offered to clean up. I let him, excusing myself to the laundry room with a basket in hand that didn't really need sorting. I needed the space more than the task. I needed to breathe in a room where memory hadn't yet taken root. As I folded towels, my thoughts spun quietly. There was no single word for what had transpired. It hadn't been an affair. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been a crossing. Of lines, of expectations, of identities. A shift in gravity that made everything else tilt slightly out of alignment. When I returned to the kitchen, he had already tidied up and stepped outside. I saw him through the window, sitting on the back steps with a cup of coffee, his shoulders hunched slightly, not in shame but in contemplation. I didn't join him. I wasn't ready yet. I spent the afternoon moving slowly through the house. I dusted shelves that didn't need dusting, organized the spice rack, wiped fingerprints off doorknobs. I needed order, even the illusion of it. Something I could control. In the late afternoon, I heard the front door open. My husband's voice carried down the hallway as he announced his arrival, keys jingling in his hand. I stiffened slightly, turning off the vacuum with more force than necessary. I hadn't seen him in almost 2 days. I wasn't sure I was ready to. He entered the kitchen, dropped his bag by the table, and glanced around. "You rearranged the living room?" he asked. "No," I replied simply, without looking up. "Just cleaned." He nodded, as though that explained everything. Maybe it did, to him. He opened the fridge, pulled out a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter. I avoided his gaze, pretending to check my phone. A few minutes later, my stepson returned from the backyard. He paused briefly upon seeing his father, then offered a casual, "Hey." "Hey," my husband replied, uninterested. The interaction was quick, functional, void of anything personal. As if neither one had ever truly known how to engage the other. I stood between them, invisible and hypervisible all at once. The evening unfolded in predictable motions. My husband showered, changed into something more comfortable, and settled into his usual spot in the living room with the television. My stepson retreated upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen, wiping the same surface twice over. I didn't know what I expected to feel, fear, perhaps. Or maybe shame. But none of those emotions arrived. Only a strange quiet. Like the calm after a storm, when everything is too still. Before bed, I stood at the bathroom sink, brushing my teeth, my reflection catching my eye in the mirror. I studied my face, familiar and unfamiliar. I traced the lines around my eyes, the slight downturn of my lips, the curve of my neck. I didn't look guilty. I didn't look triumphant either. I looked real. Present in a way I hadn't been for a long time. I slipped into bed next to my husband, who was already dozing. His breathing was steady, indifferent. He didn't turn toward me, didn't mumble a word. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the wind returning outside. I wondered if he sensed the change in the air, if he could feel how different I was, even without knowing why. Morning would come again. With the same routine. The same chairs, the same hallways. But something fundamental had shifted inside of me. A recognition, not just of what I wanted, but of what I no longer feared admitting. And once you see yourself clearly, even just for a moment, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to pretending you're content with the life that leaves you untouched. Unnoticed. That night, I closed my eyes knowing full well that I had crossed a line. And that I wouldn't be the one to step back from it. The next morning came with the same routine but none of the same certainty. I woke before the sun had fully risen, the room still dim and cool. My husband slept soundly beside me, undisturbed by my movements. I slid out of bed carefully, not to wake him, not because I feared confrontation, but because I no longer felt the need to perform anything for him, not even the simple act of sharing space. Downstairs, the kitchen was silent. The clock ticked steadily, each second a reminder of the hours ahead I'd have to navigate in the presence of two men who didn't speak to each other and barely acknowledged the woman between them. I brewed coffee, the familiar steps giving my hands something to do. I poured it into a cup and stood by the window, looking out into the backyard. The grass had grown uneven, the flower beds near the fence starting to brown. Everything had gone slightly untended, like the inside of this house, like me. I sipped slowly, letting the heat steady me. My thoughts drifted to the previous night. The silence in bed. The conversation that hadn't happened. The man lying next to me, breathing the same air, not realizing how distant we really were. And then, like a shadow walking through a memory, the other one came into my mind. The one who saw me. Who asked if I was happy. The floor creaked upstairs. I heard the faint sound of water running, then the soft opening of a door. A few minutes later, he appeared in the hallway. He didn't come into the kitchen right away. Instead, he stood near the entry, as if unsure whether his presence was welcome. He didn't have to ask. I nodded toward the second cup I'd already poured and left on the counter. He walked in slowly, picked it up, and leaned against the opposite counter. Neither of us said anything at first. There was no need to rehash what had already been felt. My husband came down soon after, his voice disrupting the quiet like a blunt instrument. He asked about breakfast, made a passing comment about traffic, then disappeared back into the living room with his phone. Nothing had changed for him. He hadn't noticed. He wouldn't. Later that morning, I found myself in the laundry room again. I had begun to associate that space with clarity. It was small, functional, untouched by the emotional residue of other rooms. Folding clothes gave me structure. It was a rhythm I could manage. As I placed a pile of shirts onto the counter, one item slipped off. I bent to pick it up and noticed something tucked behind the dryer, a small folded piece of paper. I picked it up, expecting a receipt or scrap of packaging, but as I unfolded it, I realized it was a note. Handwritten. Short. Left early. Needed to walk. Will be back before dinner. His handwriting. Carefully printed. Not rushed. I stared at it for a long time, unsure why it unsettled me. He hadn't left because of regret. That much I believed. But the sudden space he had created, physically and emotionally, made me pause. Perhaps he needed it. Perhaps he was giving me mine. The day moved slowly. I baked bread, something I hadn't done in months. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar, grounding me in a way that surprised me. I watered the plants. I cleaned the windows. All acts of stillness, of quiet labor. My husband left in the afternoon for another meeting. He mentioned it casually, half distracted by an email on his phone. I nodded, offered him his keys from the bowl near the door, and watched him leave as though I were watching someone else's life unfold. By evening, the sun had started to lower behind the trees. I sat on the porch with a book in my lap, unread. The note was still in my pocket. I reached for it more than once, unfolded it, then folded it again. I didn't know what I expected to find in those few words, but they pulled at something inside me I wasn't ready to name. He returned just after sunset. His clothes were dusted with dirt. His shoes were muddy. He had clearly walked a long time. He didn't come inside right away, just stood near the edge of the driveway, looking at the house as if it had changed shape. I stepped off the porch, walking toward him slowly. "Long walk?" I asked, my voice quieter than usual. He nodded. "Needed air." I didn't push. We stood there for a moment, the porch light casting long shadows behind us. "I left a note," he added after a pause, as though worried I hadn't seen it. "I saw," I said. He looked down, then back at me. "I wasn't avoiding you. Just needed to move. Think." "I understand," I replied. And I did. We walked back to the house together, steps in sync but minds apart. In the kitchen, I reheated the bread, made a pot of tea, and we ate together again. Quiet, but not distant. As the evening wore on, I noticed something in him I hadn't seen before: caution. Not withdrawal, but a carefulness in how he moved, how he looked at me. As if he was waiting for a signal that everything was still okay. That what had happened hadn't broken something unspoken. I wanted to reassure him. But I didn't know how. I wasn't sure I had anything reassuring to offer. I was still unraveling the pieces of myself that had been dormant for so long. Before he went upstairs for the night, he paused at the bottom step. He looked back at me, hesitating. "Are we all right?" he asked. I looked at him for a moment, then said, "We're honest. That matters more." He nodded, understanding what I meant. Then he turned and walked upstairs. I remained in the kitchen, turning off the lights one by one, letting the dark settle gently around me. I returned to the porch with my tea, the air cooler now, the sky clear. There, under the weight of the stars, I finally let myself breathe, not just in and out, but fully. Deeply. As if I were filling lungs that hadn't worked right in years. We had crossed a line. We weren't running from it. But now came the part no one prepares you for, living with the truth once it has been spoken, even silently. And knowing there's no turning back. The morning after his return carried a strange stillness, not the fragile kind that follows conflict, but the sort that settles over people when something real has passed between them, unspoken, maybe, but impossible to forget. I woke early again, more out of habit than intention, and found myself listening for sounds in the hallway. There were none. No footsteps. No opening doors. Just silence, thick and echoing. I moved downstairs, barefoot, letting the cool floor steady me. The kitchen greeted me with its familiar hush. The kettle sat where I'd left it the night before, and the mugs were lined neatly beside the sink. I filled the kettle, turned it on, and watched the steam rise, my mind already wandering. The weight of everything hung close. What we'd crossed wasn't just a line of propriety. It was something deeper. A shift in identity, a surrender of roles we'd been pretending to hold for longer than either of us wanted to admit. He came down while the tea was still steeping. His hair was tousled, his eyes puffy with sleep, and he wore a hoodie I'd never seen before. It suited him. He looked less like a visitor, more like someone who belonged, not to the house necessarily, but to the space between us. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning," I replied, handing him a mug without asking if he wanted one. We stood side by side at the counter, sipping in silence. The sound of birds filtered through the open window, their calls more distinct than usual. Maybe I was simply listening more carefully now. Or maybe the world outside had become sharper because the world inside was so impossibly quiet. After breakfast, he offered to help clean the gutters. I told him I appreciated it. We didn't over-explain anymore. There was no need to justify our time together. It had become an unstated rhythm, one we both honored without questioning it aloud. While he worked outside, I stayed in the laundry room folding towels. I had always preferred chores that kept my hands busy but my thoughts untethered. The basket beside me held more of his clothes than mine now. It should have felt invasive. But instead, it grounded me. Each shirt, each sock, each motion reminded me that time was passing, and I was present for it. Truly present. At midday, I walked outside with a bottle of water and found him on the ladder, clearing debris with methodical focus. He looked down when I approached, sweat on his brow, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. "Thanks," he said as he descended. I handed him the bottle, our fingers brushing. He drank slowly, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. I watched him, not with longing or confusion, but with a kind of quiet awe. This was the version of him I hadn't seen when he was younger. Grounded. Capable. And entirely unaware of how deeply he unsettled me just by existing in that space. Later that afternoon, I found an old box of photos while reorganizing the hallway closet. Dusty albums, loose envelopes, yellowed corners. I carried them to the dining table and began sorting without much direction. Most of the pictures were from years ago, vacations, birthdays, everyday moments frozen in time. One photo caught my eye. It was from the first summer after I'd moved into the house. He must have been 12, maybe 13. We were both in the garden, him holding a rake, me laughing at something just off camera. There was something so familiar in the way I looked at him, even then. A softness that now felt almost prophetic. He came in from the garage as I was studying the picture. His shirt was damp from the heat, and his expression shifted when he saw the table full of memories. "Going through the archives?" he asked. "Something like that," I said, sliding the photo toward him. He picked it up, looked at it for a long moment. "That was the summer I broke the lawnmower trying to cut the front yard in diagonal lines." "I remember," I said, smiling faintly. We shared a moment of quiet laughter. The kind that comes when two people recall the same version of an event, the same mood, the same stretch of time. Then he set the photo down gently, like it meant more now than it had then. "You looked happy," he said. "I was trying to be," I replied. The honesty in that admission surprised even me. Dinner that evening was quieter than usual. My husband had left for another out-of-town conference, something he'd announced with more pride than the situation deserved. I hadn't asked when he'd return. I no longer tracked his schedule like I used to. It had stopped feeling like a shared life a long time ago. After cleaning up the kitchen, I sat outside on the back steps. The sky was tinged with deep blue, and the first stars had begun to blink into view. I pulled my sweater tighter around me and listened to the night settle. He joined me without a word, sitting a step below. We didn't face each other. We just looked out. The garden, the trees, the slow arrival of dusk, it all moved as if nothing inside us had changed. But I knew better. He broke the silence eventually. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and feel different. That maybe it was all just a moment." I turned to him. "And do you?" "No," he said. That's what scares me. I didn't respond right away. I thought about the photo, the way I'd looked at him back then. I thought about the empty spaces in my marriage, the quiet collapses no one had bothered to notice. I thought about everything we hadn't said, and everything we had said without speaking. It scares me too, I admitted. And that was enough. We sat there until the cold made its way into our bones, and still neither of us moved. Not because we were stuck, but because we knew that moving forward would mean deciding what to carry with us. That night, I returned to my room alone. I lay in bed, eyes open, listening to the creaks and sighs of the house. I wasn't waiting for footsteps or for doors to open. I was simply allowing myself to feel the consequences of everything I had chosen. And despite the weight of it, I felt no urge to undo it. Some truths, once lived, refused to return to silence. The morning felt different, though nothing in the house had changed. The same kitchen, the same light slanting through the window, the same sound of the heater clicking on for its first breath of the day. Yet everything inside me felt unsettled, like a book that had been closed mid-sentence. There was a tightness in my chest that I couldn't quite name. Not dread. Not sadness. Just the sense that something was approaching, inevitable and uncertain. I made coffee with deliberate calm, each step carried out as if by instinct. I didn't check my phone. I didn't look at the calendar. I didn't want time to be measurable, to be counted down. I wanted the moment to stretch, to linger. But it didn't. He came downstairs not long after. He was dressed, bag over his shoulder, and from the way his eyes searched the room, I knew he had been waiting to find me alone. There was a hesitation in his steps, as if he'd rehearsed a goodbye but wasn't ready to speak it. We stood in the kitchen without a word at first. The silence between us wasn't strained, but filled with weight. The kind that comes before something is said that can't be unsaid. I think I should go, he said finally, setting his bag down by the door. I didn't answer right away. I watched his hands, how they moved over the zipper, fidgeting, looking for something to hold on to. He wasn't uncertain about the choice, only about the words. I understood. For how long? I asked quietly. I don't know yet, he said. Maybe a week. Maybe more. I nodded slowly, letting the reality settle. There was no fight in me, no resistance. I had always known this day would come. That something would force us to step back and reassess the shape we had taken. We were no longer the people we had pretended to be, he, the guest passing through, me, the wife waiting for life to resume. We had become something that no longer fit in this house. Not safely. I'm not running, he added. I know, I said. He stepped closer, just enough for our shoulders to brush. I just need space to figure out what this all means. I didn't argue. The truth was, I needed the same. After he left, the house felt hollow in a new way. Not the usual emptiness of routine or loneliness, but the kind that comes after something real has passed through and left a mark. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I moved through the room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the frames on the wall, the edge of the window he had opened the day before to let in fresh air. In the laundry room, I found a shirt he had left behind. Not carelessly, but intentionally, folded on top of the dryer like a quiet farewell. I held it for a moment, pressed it to my chest, then placed it in the drawer beneath the towels. Later in the day, my husband returned. He brought flowers. A gesture that felt both misplaced and overdue. He smiled, kissed my cheek, commented on how quiet the house seemed. Did he leave? He asked. I nodded. This morning. Did he say when he'd be back? Not exactly. He didn't press. Maybe he knew better than to ask. Or maybe he simply didn't want to hear the answers. He placed the flowers in a vase and moved on, already talking about his meetings and the flight he might need to take next week. The rhythm of our disconnection resumed as if it had never been interrupted. That evening, I sat on the back porch, watching the sky turn. It had rained earlier, and the grass smelled damp, alive. I thought about the days ahead, what they would look like without him here, without the strange comfort of his presence filling the gaps I hadn't realized were so wide. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel relief either. What I felt was something deeper, a readiness to live with the truth. Not the fantasy of what could have been, but the reality of what had been and what still mattered. This wasn't the end of something. It was the quiet acknowledgement that life, once stirred, cannot be returned to stillness. That what we feel, when fully seen, changes the architecture of who we are. When I went to bed that night, I lay awake again, not restless, but awake in the truest sense. My husband turned over beside me, already half asleep, unaware of the storm that had passed through while he'd been gone. I closed my eyes and whispered his name, not my husband's, but the one who had seen me, heard me, reached me. I didn't say it aloud. Just felt it rise and fall in the rhythm of my breath. And then I slept. Not peacefully, not fully, but knowing that whatever came next, I had lived this. Fully. Quietly. Honestly. Without permission. Without apology.